Hey, y'all, and welcome back to the Winning Wednesday podcast. I am your host, Geneva Brown, and today's message is called Obedience Can Be Uncomfortable. If God asked you to do something that cost you comfort, reputation, or control, would you call it obedience? Most of us don't struggle with hearing God's voice. We struggle with obeying it when it asks us to do something uncomfortable. When God's direction challenges us, challenges our plans, our fears, or our sense of control, it can be tempting to run in the other way, which is the center of our story today in the book of Jonah. Jonah, his story reminds us that obedience often begins where comfort ends. And just to summarize his story really quick, God called Jonah to go to Nineveh and to warn the people to repent. But Jonah ran in the opposite direction to avoid the assignment. A violent storm came, and it led Jonah to being thrown into a sea, where God provided a great fish to swallow him. From inside the fish, Jonah prayed and surrendered to God's will. And after being delivered, Jonah obeyed and went to Nineveh, where the people repented and experienced God's mercy. So Jonah's story, it isn't just about a prophet and a whale. It's about a heart that didn't want to move when God said go. God asked Jonah to go to Nineveh, a place where he feared and resented. How many times does God ask us to go places where we're afraid of, or a place that we have to go back to that causes us resentment? It wasn't convenient for Jonah, and it wasn't comfortable either. And it definitely wasn't what Jonah wanted. So Jonah ran in the opposite direction, as do we, hoping that the distance would quiet God's call. But God's will has a way of meeting us even in the storms that we create. Jonah wanted God's mercy for himself, but not for others. He wanted God to handle the hard part, changing hearts, forgiving enemies, while he stayed safely within his own comfort zone. And that's where many of us are. We don't want to obey God's direction because it takes us out of our comfort zones. So, how often do we do the same? We ask God to fix situations, to soften people's hearts. We ask Him to open up doors, to remove obstacles, while resisting the very step of obedience He's asking of us. We want God to do the heavy lifting while we stick to what feels easy and familiar. But what would it benefit God if He did it for us instead of through us? God doesn't need our obedience to accomplish His plans, but He invites us to it. Obedience grows us. So if God forced Jonah to Nineveh without Jonah's participation, Jonah would have missed the transformation that came from his surrender. Faith doesn't grow when everything is done on our behalf. It grows when we trust God enough to move, and even when we're afraid. When Jonah finally obeyed, he discovered that God was already at work ahead of him. And sometimes we'll find that same thing happening with us. When we finally come to the end of ourselves, when we finally realize that the direction that God told us to go in was the very best direction, and when we're ready to go ahead and finally obey Him, we'll see that God was already at work ahead of us, doing what only He can do. The city had already repented, lives were changed, and Jonah learned that God's compassion was far bigger than his comfort. A lot of the times when we are asking God to do things for us, He wants us to join Him in His work. So the very same thing that we may be asking God to do for us, God is also asking us to do to others. Jonah wanted God's grace and mercy, but God was asking Jonah to give others grace and mercy. And that is especially true in our world today. We want so much grace and mercy. We want to see so much change. But God is asking us, can you be the change? Can you be that person that starts the grace and the mercy? It's an even exchange, but we get to see the true power of God. So stepping out didn't just reveal God's power, it revealed God's heart. Each uncomfortable yes stretches our faith. It teaches us that God is faithful beyond what we can see. God still calls us out of our comfort zones today, not to punish us, but to shape us. He asks us to do the hard things so that we can learn to trust Him in deeper ways. When we stop asking God to do only the hard things and to start offering Him our obedience, we will discover that faith grows strongest, not in our comfort, but in our surrender. So finally, friends, Jonah reminds us that reluctance doesn't cancel God's call. It only reveals where our trust is still growing. That is the Winning Wednesday word. If today's word has encouraged you in any way, would you consider sharing the Winning Wednesday podcast with someone? Thank y'all for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.